That tattoo doesn't belong on this ship, old man. Lieutenant Mark Ellison said it loud enough for the nearest sailors to hear, and the words cut across the steel deck of the USS Arlington sharper than the Atlantic wind. The morning ceremony had not yet begun, but the ship already felt like a cathedral made of gray metal and salt air. Flags snapped hard above the rail. Dress uniforms stood in neat rows under the white glare of a coastal sun. Somewhere forward, a bosun's whistle gave one clean note, then silence returned, heavy and expectant. At the top of the gangway stood Caleb Whitaker, 83 years old, white-haired, thin-shouldered, wearing a dark suit that had been brushed clean but had clearly survived more years than most of the men staring at it. In his right hand, he held a single white flower wrapped in paper. In his left hand, half hidden beneath the loose cuff of his shirt, was the reason Lieutenant Ellison had stopped him. The tattoo was old. Faded almost to blue-gray. A broken anchor, 2 rope rings, and a small split star at the center, stretched across skin that time had made pale and fragile. To anyone passing by, it looked like a bad piece of ink from some forgotten shore town. To Ellison, it looked like an insult. He was 31, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, with polished shoes and the hard posture of a man who had recently discovered how much authority a uniform could give him. He stepped between Caleb and the memorial area as if blocking a trespasser from private property. "This deck is restricted," Ellison said. "Family, command staff, and verified guests only." Caleb looked past him, not around him, toward the open water off the starboard side. His eyes were pale blue, steady, and far away. "I was asked to come," he said. His voice was quiet, rough at the edges, like gravel under rain. Ellison gave a short laugh, the kind meant less for humor than for audience. A few young sailors near the rail shifted their weight. One of them smirked before catching himself. "Asked by who?" Ellison said. "Because your name is not on my VIP list." Caleb lowered his gaze to the flower in his hand. "Someone who isn't on your list either." That answer tightened Ellison's face. He looked Caleb up and down, taking in the worn cuffs, the old shoes, the plain tie, the small tremor in the fingers holding the flower. He did not see a veteran. He saw an inconvenience. He saw an old man who had wandered into a ceremony built for people with ribbons, ranks, and laminated clearance. Then his eyes dropped again to the faded mark on Caleb's wrist. "Let me guess," Ellison said, loud enough now that the nearest row of sailors turned their heads. "You got that in some bar outside San Diego and decided it made you part of something classified." Caleb did not answer. The wind lifted the edge of his cuff and revealed more of the broken anchor. Ellison's mouth bent into a thin smile. "Men earn symbols," he said. "They don't borrow them." Petty Officer Daniel Price, standing 6 feet away with a clipboard tucked against his chest, looked up sharply. He was only 24, still young enough to respect volume, but old enough to recognize when volume was hiding weakness. Something about Caleb's silence unsettled him. The old man had not grown angry. He had not pleaded. He simply stood there, small against the ship, with the ocean behind him and a white flower in his hand, absorbing the insult like a man who had survived worse weather than this. Ellison took one step closer. "You hear me, sir," he said, the word "sir" stripped clean of respect. "That tattoo doesn't get you access to this ceremony. Not today." Caleb finally looked at him. For one brief second, the air seemed to tighten. Not because Caleb threatened him. Not because he raised his voice. But because there was something in those old eyes that did not belong to a harmless visitor. Something deep. Something measured. Something that had learned long ago not to waste breath on men who mistook a gait for honor. "I came to put this flower in the water," Caleb said. "That's all." Ellison looked at the flower, then back at the tattoo, and shook his head. "Not with fake war ink on my deck." The words landed hard. Even the wind seemed to pause around them. Price felt his stomach drop, though he could not yet explain why. Caleb's fingers closed slightly around the paper stem. The flower trembled once, then stilled. Beyond the rail, the Atlantic moved in low dark swells, 20 feet below, carrying sunlight in broken strips. Caleb turned his eyes toward it again, as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. Ellison reached out, not roughly, but with the careless confidence of a man certain he had the right. He caught Caleb's sleeve between two fingers and lifted it higher, exposing the faded broken anchor to the morning light. "Look at this," he said to the sailors nearby. "This is exactly what I'm talking about." A few faces leaned in. A few smiles appeared, uncertain and thin. Then Ellison's fingertip brushed the center of the split star. Caleb stopped breathing. The deck, the flags, the polished shoes, the rows of uniforms, all of it seemed to fall away from his face. His eyes did not close, but they were no longer seeing the USS Arlington. Petty Officer Price saw the change happen and felt the hair rise along the back of his neck. In that instant, Caleb Whitaker looked less like an old man being embarrassed on a ship and more like a locked door that someone had just opened by mistake. For a moment, Caleb Whitaker was gone from the deck without moving an inch. The young lieutenant still had two fingers on his sleeve, the sailors still leaned in with uncertain smiles, and the Atlantic still rolled 20 feet below the rail, but Caleb had slipped somewhere none of them could follow. The smell of fresh paint and salt air became something older in his mind, wet rope, cold metal, diesel fumes, and rain coming sideways in the dark. The bright morning sun became a hard white flare hanging over black water. The sharp lines of the USS Arlington blurred into the memory of another vessel, smaller, quieter, moving without lights through a sea that did not forgive mistakes. Caleb was 29 again, though the weight in his chest felt older even then. His hands were steady. His breathing was slow. Around him, 4 men waited in silence, their faces lit and erased by the weak glow of covered instruments. No one wore a patch. No one carried anything that could be explained if found. No one said the name of the operation. Because officially it had never had one. That was how those missions worked. You went where the paper did not go. You followed orders that would disappear before dawn. You came home with nothing to prove you had been there except the memories that sat behind your eyes for the rest of your life. In that darkness, a young officer had been pulled from the water half frozen, barely conscious, wrapped in a torn survival blanket and trying not to shake. His name was Nathaniel Mercer then, not Admiral Mercer, not Commander, not the man whose photograph would one day hang in headquarters. Just Nathaniel, 23 years old, pale with cold, proud enough to keep apologizing through chattering teeth because he believed he had slowed them down. Caleb remembered gripping the young man by the shoulder and telling him to stop wasting breath. He remembered the look Mercer gave him, embarrassed, grateful, and afraid of what gratitude might cost. Later, when the sky began to lighten at the edge of the world, the 5 survivors sat below deck with a medical kit open between them. They did not cheer. They did not speak of medals. One of them found a small bottle of blue-black marking ink. Another bent a needle from a field kit. The symbol was drawn first on a scrap of paper, a broken anchor, because they had been cut loose, 2 rings of rope, because they had come back tied to each other, a split star, because the mission would never exist on any official wall. Caleb had pressed the first mark into his own skin with the care of a man signing a promise. Then he had marked Mercer, who watched without looking away. "We sank," Caleb had said softly, "but we did not break." The memory folded shut as quickly as it had opened. Caleb returned to the present with Ellison's fingertips still resting near the old ink. The young lieutenant was still talking, still performing for the sailors, but his words arrived muffled, thin, almost distant. Caleb gently pulled his arm back. Not with force. Not with anger. Just enough to end the touch. The motion was small, but something in it made the closest sailors stop smiling. Ellison noticed the shift and frowned, as if the silence itself had disobeyed him. Petty Officer Daniel Price had not moved. His clipboard was still pressed against his chest, but his eyes were locked on the tattoo. Broken anchor. 2 rope rings. Split star. The details moved through his memory like a key searching for a lock. He had seen it before. Not on skin. Not in a bar. Not in a souvenir shop. In the heritage room below decks, inside a glass case no one visited much, there was an old photograph turned slightly yellow at the edges. 5 young men stood shoulder to shoulder beside a gray bulkhead, faces half hidden by shadow, sleeves rolled up just enough to show matching marks on their left arms. The caption beneath it had been almost useless, just 3 words typed on a card, "Unverified Maritime Team." Price remembered asking an old chief about it during his first month aboard. The chief had looked at the picture, then at Price, and said in a low voice, "Some things stay unverified because the country needed them that way." Now Price stared at Caleb Whitaker's wrist and felt the deck seem less solid under his shoes. Ellison pointed toward the gangway. "I am giving you one chance to leave with dignity." Caleb looked at him with tired patience. "Dignity is not something you give, Lieutenant." The sentence was quiet, but it landed harder than a shout. Ellison's jaw tightened. "Then you can leave without it." That was the moment Price made his decision. He stepped back from the small circle, careful not to draw Ellison's attention. The ceremony bell had not sounded yet. The Admiral had not arrived. There were still a few minutes before the first wreath would be carried forward. Price turned toward the starboard passageway and walked fast, then faster, the clipboard forgotten under one arm. Behind him, Ellison's voice rose again, sharp and official. Ahead of him, the narrow passage swallowed the wind. Price reached the communications alcove with his pulse beating in his throat. He picked up the secure handset and gave his name, his station, and the one phrase he was almost afraid to say aloud. "I need someone to check an old maritime insignia. Broken anchor, 2 rope rings, split star." On the other end, the line went silent. The silence on. The secure line lasted only 2 seconds, but to Petty Officer Daniel Price it felt long enough for the whole ship to hear his heartbeat. Then a woman's voice answered, lower than before, stripped of routine. "Repeat that description." Price swallowed and looked back over his shoulder. Through the passageway opening, he could still hear Lieutenant Mark Ellison on the deck, his voice sharp and rising, pushing the old man toward a public humiliation he did not understand. Price turned back to the handset. "Broken anchor," he said carefully. 2 rope rings around it. A split star in the center. Faded blue-gray ink on the left wrist of an elderly man named Caleb Whitaker. The woman did not ask him to spell the name. That was the first thing that made Price's stomach tighten. The second was the sound of movement on the other end, a chair scraping, papers shifting, another phone being picked up in a room far away. "Hold this line," she said. "Do not hang up. Do not discuss this with anyone on deck." Price stared at the gray bulkhead in front of him. The ship hummed around him with quiet power, engines, ventilation, distant footsteps, the 1,000 small sounds of a vessel alive beneath steel. He had spent 2 years learning that the Navy loved procedure, forms, chains of command, written orders, stamped clearances. But this did not feel like procedure. This felt like someone had opened a door under the floor. On the memorial deck, Caleb Whitaker stood where Price had left him, the white flower still in his right hand. The wind had grown stronger, pressing his suit jacket against his thin frame. Lieutenant Ellison had moved closer, boxing him in with posture rather than force, using the clean angles of authority to make an old man seem out of place. "You are delaying a formal ceremony," Ellison said. "Do you understand that?" Caleb looked at the rows of chairs set near the rail, then at the water beyond them. "I have been late before," he said. "Not often. Not when it mattered." A few sailors glanced at one another. The answer sounded strange, not defensive, not confused, but weighted with something they could not measure. Ellison mistook the uncertainty for support. "This is not a place for riddles." Caleb's mouth moved almost into a smile, but it never became one. "No," he said. "It is a place for names." That irritated Ellison more than anger would have. Anger he could handle. Anger fit into rules. This old man's calm did not. It stood there like a weathered post in a storm, refusing to bend simply because a younger man had ordered it to. "Your name is not on the list," Ellison said. Caleb nodded once. "Most of the names that matter are not." Below decks, Price listened as the call climbed upward. First the Heritage Office. Then the Command Duty Desk. Then a captain's aide. Each new voice came on colder and more careful than the last. Each time Price repeated the symbol and Caleb's name, the line changed temperature. Nobody laughed. Nobody dismissed him. Nobody said Tourist Inc. At last, a man's voice came through, older, clipped, carrying the kind of authority that made even static sound formal. "Petty Officer, this is Captain Elias Hayes. You are looking at the man right now?" Price straightened without thinking. "Yes, sir." "Is anyone touching him?" Price looked toward the passageway opening again. He could see only a slice of deck, Ellison's black shoes, Caleb's old brown ones, the white flower hanging low at his side. "Not at this moment, sir." "Keep it that way." Price felt his mouth go dry. "Sir." Captain Hayes lowered his voice. "Listen carefully. You will return to the deck. You will not challenge Lieutenant Ellison directly unless safety requires it. You will observe. You will buy time. The Admiral is being notified." Price gripped the handset harder. "Admiral Mercer, sir." The pause that followed was different from the others. "Yes," Hayes said. "And Petty Officer, if that tattoo is real, then that man is not a guest. He is a reason this ceremony exists." Price placed the handset down with more care than he had ever used for any piece of equipment in his life. For one breath, he stood alone in the communications alcove, hearing the words echo in him. Not a guest. A reason. Then he turned and moved back toward the wind. When he stepped onto the deck again, the situation had sharpened. Ellison was pointing toward the gangway now, his expression hard, his patience gone. Caleb had not moved. The flower in his hand had lost one petal to the wind, a small white shape that skittered across the steel and vanished near a drain. Price walked faster. "Lieutenant," he called, keeping his voice controlled. Ellison turned, annoyed. "Where did you go?" Price stopped 3 feet away. His eyes flicked to Caleb, then back to the officer. "There may be a verification issue, sir." Ellison stared at him. "Verification of what?" Price felt the whole deck watching. "Of Mr. Whitaker." The lieutenant's face changed, just slightly. "There is nothing to verify. He is not on the list." Caleb looked at Price then, and for the first time since the confrontation began, the old man's eyes showed something besides distance. Not surprise. Not gratitude. Recognition, maybe, of a young man choosing the harder road. Price held that look for half a second before Ellison stepped into it. "Petty Officer, you are out of line." Price kept his hands at his sides. "Yes, sir," he said. "But Command is checking his name." Ellison gave a short laugh. "Command has better things to do than investigate a faded tattoo." Before Price could answer, the ship's loudspeaker clicked overhead. The clean electronic tone rolled across the deck and cut every conversation in half. Then came the voice from the bridge, formal and unmistakably tense. "All stations, hold ceremonial sequence. Repeat, hold ceremonial sequence. Command staff to standby." The sailors froze. The honor detail stopped mid-position. The wind moved through the flags with a hard snapping sound. Ellison looked up at the speaker, then back at Price, and for the first time, uncertainty touched his face. Caleb Whitaker simply lowered his eyes to the white flower, as if he had known the sea would remember before the men did. Admiral Nathaniel Mercer did not hurry, but every step he took seemed to shorten the distance with the weight of history. The deck of the USS Arlington had gone still around him. Sailors who had been whispering only moments earlier now stood with their shoulders squared and their eyes forward, caught between ceremony and something older than ceremony. Lieutenant Mark Ellison straightened so hard his polished shoes clicked together, but the Admiral did not look at him. Not once. His attention remained fixed on Caleb Whitaker, the thin old man in the worn dark suit, holding a white flower as the Atlantic wind pulled at his silver hair. When Mercer stopped in front of him, the two men said nothing. For a long second, all that moved was the flag above them and the water below, dark and restless 20 feet beneath the rail. Then the Admiral raised his right hand in a slow, perfect salute. The motion was clean, formal, and absolute. It was not the salute an admiral gave a visitor. It was not courtesy for an elderly guest. It was the kind of salute a man gave when rank no longer mattered because memory outranked everything on the deck. Caleb looked at the salute, then at Mercer's face. Something passed between them that no one else could hear. A night. A promise. A debt carried for more than 50 years. Caleb shifted the flower carefully into his left hand and returned the salute with his right. His arm did not rise quickly. Age had stolen speed from him, and time had left a tremor in his fingers, but the salute was steady where it mattered. It held. Around them, the sailors did not breathe. Petty Officer Daniel Price felt his throat tighten. Chief Briggs lowered his eyes. Captain Hayes stood behind Mercer with the expression of a man witnessing a page of history being opened in public. Lieutenant Ellison looked from Caleb to the Admiral, confusion working through his face in sharp, uncomfortable pieces. He had expected correction. He had expected an explanation. He had expected the Admiral to restore the order he believed had been disrupted. Instead, Admiral Mercer was saluting the man Ellison had just tried to remove from the ship. Mercer lowered his hand first. Caleb followed. The Admiral's voice, when it came, was low enough that the deck leaned toward it. Caleb. The name sounded different in his mouth. Not like a name pulled from a file. Like one recovered from weather, distance, and years of silence. Caleb nodded once. Nathaniel. A small shock moved through the officers nearby. No one called the Admiral by his first name. No one on that deck. Not captains. Not commanders. Not aides with secure phones and polished brass. But Caleb Whitaker had said it quietly, and Mercer had accepted it like a man accepting the truth of his own reflection. Ellison cleared his throat. It was a small sound, but in that silence it felt reckless. Admiral, sir, I was only enforcing access control. This individual was not on the authorized guest list, and he presented an unverified marking that appeared to be inappropriate for the occasion. Mercer's eyes moved to him at last. The look was not angry. Anger would have been easier. It was colder than anger, steadier, the gaze of a man measuring not a mistake, but the character beneath it. This individual, Mercer said, is Caleb Whitaker. Ellison swallowed. Yes, sir, but I had no confirmation of his status. No, Mercer said. You had his age. You had his clothes. You had a faded mark you did not understand. And you decided that was enough. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. They struck cleanly and left nothing to hide behind. Ellison's face lost color. The young sailors who had laughed earlier stood rigid now, their eyes fixed on the deck. Caleb glanced toward them, and there was no accusation in his expression. That somehow made it worse. Mercer turned slightly, giving the whole deck his voice. There are names in this Navy that do not appear on public programs. There are missions that do not fit inside ceremony folders. And there are men who carried this country through places so quiet that history had to whisper around them. The wind pressed Mercer's sleeve against his left forearm. For the first time, Ellison's eyes dropped to it. The Admiral noticed. He reached to his cuff with deliberate care. One button. Then the second. The deck seemed to narrow around that motion. Caleb closed his eyes, just briefly. Mercer rolled the sleeve upward, past the wrist, past the line where sunlight met skin. There, on the Admiral's forearm, older but darker than Caleb's, was the same broken anchor, the same 2 rope rings, the same split star. A sound moved through the sailors, not quite a gasp, not quite a breath. Ellison stared as if the world had shifted under his feet. Mercer looked at his own mark for a moment, then back at Caleb. "He gave me this after he carried me out of the water," the Admiral said. "And I have spent 51 years knowing I was alive because he refused to let the sea keep me." Caleb opened his eyes. The Atlantic flashed behind him in broken silver. He looked not proud, not victorious, but tired in the way only old promises can make a man tired. The flower trembled once in his hand. Mercer stepped aside and turned toward the rail. "This ceremony will continue," he said. "But first, Mr. Whittaker will place his flower." No one objected. No one moved ahead of him. The entire deck waited as Caleb took his first slow step toward the water. Caleb Whittaker walked toward the rail with the measured pace of a man crossing more than steel. Every step seemed to carry him backward through years the rest of them could not see. The sailors parted without being ordered. Dress shoes shifted softly across the deck. Shoulders turned. Heads bowed. No one spoke. Even Lieutenant Mark Ellison stepped aside, not because anyone told him to, but because the space in front of Caleb suddenly felt as if it belonged to someone else, someone older than rank and quieter than command. Admiral Nathaniel Mercer walked half a step behind him, close enough to steady him if needed, far enough not to take ownership of the moment. Caleb noticed. He always noticed distance. In his life, distance had meant survival, trust, timing, and the thin difference between being found and being forgotten. At the rail, Caleb stopped. The Atlantic stretched wide and hard beneath the morning sun, dark blue broken by silver light, rolling against the gray side of the ship with a steady sound like breath drawn through old lungs. He held the white flower over the water. For the first time that morning, his hand shook openly. Not from fear. Not from weakness. From memory finally allowed to move. Mercer stood beside him now, his left sleeve still rolled up, the broken anchor visible on his forearm. The sailors behind them could see both marks at once, one faded almost to a ghost on Caleb's wrist, one darker on the Admiral's arm. Same anchor. Same rope. Same split star. 2 old promises written on skin while the rest of the country had been allowed to sleep. Caleb looked down at the flower. "It was for Reed," he said. Mercer's face changed at the name. The lines around his eyes deepened, and for a moment the Admiral looked less like a commander and more like the young officer Caleb had once pulled from cold water under a sky without witnesses. "I know," Mercer said. The name moved quietly through the nearest sailors. Reed. No rank attached. No biography. Just a name dropped into the wind with enough weight to quiet the ship. Caleb's thumb brushed the bent stem. "He hated white flowers," he said. Mercer gave a small breath that might have been a laugh if grief had not caught it first. "He said they looked too clean for men like us." Caleb's eyes stayed on the water. He was right. The flower hovered above the rail, trembling in the wind. Behind them, Petty Officer Daniel Price stood beside Chief Briggs, watching with the stunned stillness of someone realizing history was not always locked behind glass. Sometimes it walked aboard in worn shoes and waited to be recognized. Captain Hayes had removed his cover. Several sailors followed his example without command. One by one, white caps came down against chests. Ellison saw the motion spread and did the same a second late, his face tight with shame. He had no script for this. No regulation could tell him where to put his eyes after mocking a man the Admiral had just honored before the entire deck. Caleb finally released the flower. It did not fall straight. The wind caught it first, lifted it, turned it once in the sunlight, then let it drift down toward the water 20 feet below. Every eye followed it. The white bloom struck the surface gently, rocked in the wake, and began to move away from the ship. Caleb watched until it became small against the dark blue. "We were 5, he said. The deck seemed to lean closer. Mercer's jaw tightened, but he did not interrupt. 5 went out. 4 came back breathing. 3 made it home. 2 kept the mark." His voice remained level, but something under it had gone raw with age. "Now I suppose that makes 1. Mercer turned toward him. "No," he said, and there was command in the word, but also devotion. "It makes 2. Caleb looked at the Admiral's exposed forearm. The broken anchor sat there in the sunlight, proof that memory had not died in a file cabinet or under a classified stamp. For the first time, the old man's expression softened. Not into happiness. That would have been too simple. It softened into relief, the kind a man feels when he realizes he did not carry a promise alone after all. Behind them, Ellison took 1 step forward. His voice came out quieter than anyone expected. "Mr. Whitaker." Caleb turned, slowly. The lieutenant's posture was still formal, but something had been stripped from it. The hardness was gone. What remained was a young officer standing inside the damage of his own arrogance. "I was wrong," Ellison said. "I treated you without respect. I am sorry." The apology hung in the sea air. Caleb studied him for a long moment. The deck waited, not for punishment, but for judgment. Caleb could have made the silence hurt. He could have let the young man stand there and feel every second of it. Instead, he looked back toward the water. "Learn faster than I did," he said. Ellison blinked. "Sir." Caleb's eyes stayed on the drifting flower. "That is all any old man can ask of the young." Mercer looked at Caleb then, and something like pride moved across his face. The Admiral turned to the honor detail. "Resume the ceremony," he said. But the ceremony that resumed was not the one printed in the programs. It was heavier now. Cleaner. More honest. As the first bell sounded across the deck, every sailor stood a little straighter, not because an admiral was present, but because Caleb Whitaker was. The first bell rang clean across the deck, a single bright note carried out over the Atlantic, and the sound seemed to gather every man and woman aboard into the same breath. The ceremony resumed, but nothing about it felt routine anymore. Names were read from a card in Captain Hayes's hands, yet each name now seemed to belong not only to the past, but to the living silence standing beside the rail. Caleb Whitaker remained. Near Admiral Nathaniel Mercer, his sleeve lowered again, the faded broken anchor hidden beneath old fabric. He did not ask to stand in front. He did not ask for a chair. He did not ask for anyone to look at him. That was why everyone did. The honor detail moved with a precision that had become reverence. White gloves lifted the wreath. Boots aligned on painted deck lines. The American flag snapped above them, hard and bright in the wind, while the ship rolled slightly underfoot, steady as a great animal breathing beneath steel. Petty Officer Daniel Price watched from his place near Chief Briggs, unable to shake the image of the photograph in the Heritage Room. 5 young men. 1 gray bulkhead. Sleeves rolled up. Faces half swallowed by shadow. He had passed that photograph dozens of times without stopping. Now it felt as if the ship had been waiting for him to understand it. Lieutenant Mark Ellison stood a few yards away, formal and silent, but the old certainty had left him. His eyes stayed forward, yet his mind clearly kept returning to the same moments, his finger on Caleb's sleeve, his voice raised before the sailors, his careless words about borrowed symbols. Shame had a way of making a uniform feel heavier. Caleb seemed to know that without looking at him. Old men who had carried regret could hear it in others. When the final name was read, Captain Hayes lowered the card, and Admiral Mercer stepped forward. The Admiral's voice carried without effort. "This ship remembers those whose names were recorded," he said. "Today, it will also remember those whose service was not." The words moved across the deck like a slow current. No one shifted. Mercer turned slightly toward Caleb, but did not point at him, did not expose him further than honor required. Some men serve in daylight. Some serve where daylight cannot follow. The value of sacrifice is not decided by how many people are allowed to read about it. Caleb's eyes dropped to the deck. Praise had always made him more uncomfortable than insult. Insult could be endured. Praise asked a man to accept that his ghosts had weight in other people's hearts. Mercer continued, his left sleeve now buttoned again. The matching mark hidden but not forgotten. Years ago, a handful of sailors carried a promise through dark water and silence. Because of them, men came home. Because of one of them, I am standing here today. A few heads turned toward Caleb despite themselves. He did not move. Only his fingers curled once against his palm, as if remembering rope, cold rails, and the shape of a young officer's shoulder under his hand. Ellison swallowed. Price saw it. So did Chief Briggs. The lieutenant was hearing, perhaps for the first time, the difference between a story and a life. Then Mercer stepped back, and the chaplain offered a short prayer that spoke of service, memory, and the sea receiving what men could no longer hold. No one exaggerated the moment. No one turned it into theater. That restraint made it stronger. When the prayer ended, the honor detail released the wreath over the rail. It turned slowly in the air, green leaves and white flowers flashing once in the sun before touching the water. The smaller flower Caleb had dropped earlier floated several yards away, separate but moving in the same direction. For a moment, the two white shapes drifted on parallel lines, one official, one personal, both carried by the same tide. Price would remember that image for the rest of his life. Ellison would too. Caleb watched until both flowers were beyond the ship's shadow. Mercer leaned closer, speaking so only Caleb could hear, though the nearest sailor sensed the gravity in the quiet. "You should have been invited properly." Caleb gave the faintest shake of his head. "I was invited by the only man who still could." Mercer looked toward the water. "Read." Caleb nodded. "Every year." The Admiral closed his eyes for one breath. When he opened them, they were wet but steady. "I thought I was the only one who remembered the date." Caleb's voice was soft. "That is the trouble with surviving, Nathaniel. You spend years believing the silence belongs only to you." Mercer did not answer. He simply stood beside him, two old men facing the same sea, divided by rank, joined by something rank could not touch. Behind them, Lieutenant Ellison finally understood that the true punishment was not going to be public. The Admiral did not need to humiliate him. Caleb did not need to condemn him. The deck itself had become the lesson. Every sailor there had seen what arrogance looked like when it met history. Every sailor had seen how small certainty could become in front of a quiet truth. When the ceremony ended, no one moved at first. The command staff waited. The sailors waited. Even the wind seemed to hold its place. Then Chief Briggs stepped forward and saluted Caleb. Petty Officer Price followed. One by one, without order, the sailors on the deck raised their hands. Not fast. Not dramatic. Just clean, steady, and sincere. Caleb turned, startled by the sound of sleeves moving all at once. He looked across the rows of young faces, many of them ashamed, many humbled, all silent. For the first time that morning, he seemed uncertain what to do with the honor being given to him. Admiral Mercer did not help him. He only watched, because some moments had to be received alone. Caleb raised his hand slowly. The old salute returned, weathered but unbroken. Out beyond the rail, the two flowers moved farther into the Atlantic, and the ship stood still around the man it had almost turned away. The salute lasted only a few seconds, but it changed the shape of the morning. When Caleb Whitaker lowered his hand, the sailors lowered theirs with him, and the sound of it was soft, almost private, sleeves settling, gloves brushing fabric, breath returning to bodies that had forgotten to breathe. No one clapped. No one spoke. Applause would have made the moment smaller. Admiral Nathaniel Mercer stepped beside Caleb and placed one hand lightly near his elbow, not holding him, only offering steadiness if the old man chose to accept it. Caleb did not pull away. Together they turned from the rail, leaving the two white flowers to the Atlantic. The ceremony had officially ended, but the deck remained arranged around Caleb as if the ship itself had not decided how to let him go. Captain Hayes approached first, his cover tucked beneath one arm. He stopped 2 feet away and gave Caleb the careful respect of a man addressing history in human form. "Sir," Hayes said, "on behalf of the command staff, I apologize for the way you were received." Caleb looked at him, then at the rows of young sailors beyond him. "A ship is made of people," he said. "People make mistakes." The answer was gentle, but it did not excuse anything. That was what made it powerful. Lieutenant Mark Ellison stood apart from the others, hands at his sides, face pale under the sun. Mercer noticed him, but did not call him forward. Not yet. Instead, the Admiral turned to Petty Officer Daniel Price. "Petty Officer." Price stiffened. "Yes, Admiral." "You made the call." Price's throat worked once. "Yes, sir." Mercer studied him with the same measured gaze that had silenced Ellison earlier, but there was warmth under it now. "Why?" Price glanced at Caleb's sleeve, where the tattoo had disappeared again beneath the cuff. "Because he did not look like a man trying to prove something, sir." The answer seemed to settle over the deck. Chief Briggs gave the smallest nod. Mercer held Price's eyes another moment, then said, "That instinct will serve you better than any checklist. Do not lose it." Price's face changed with the effort of staying composed. "Yes, sir." Caleb turned toward him. "You remembered the photograph." Price blinked. "Yes, sir. In the heritage room." Caleb's gaze drifted toward the interior passageway, toward some place below decks he had never visited but somehow already knew. "Still there, is it?" Price nodded. "Yes, sir. 5 men. No names." A faint shadow moved across Caleb's face. "There were names." Mercer's jaw tightened. "There still are." He looked to Captain Hayes. "After today, that display will be corrected as much as the record allows." Hayes answered immediately. "Yes, Admiral." Caleb did not seem pleased. He seemed burdened. "Careful with records, Nathaniel," he said quietly. "They make neat lines out of things that were never neat." Mercer looked at him for a long moment. "Then we will make them honest, not neat." The words held. Even Caleb could not argue with them. That was when Mercer finally turned toward Ellison. The lieutenant took one step forward before being ordered, as if shame itself had pulled him into place. He stopped in front of Caleb, not the Admiral. That choice mattered. His voice was controlled, but low. "Mr. Whitaker, I owe you more than an apology. I questioned your service, your honor, and your right to stand here. I did that in front of sailors I am supposed to lead. I was wrong." Caleb looked at the young officer for a long time. The wind moved over the deck. Somewhere below, a hatch closed with a distant metal echo. Ellison held still, accepting the silence now instead of trying to fill it. Caleb saw the difference. "Lieutenant," he said at last, "the uniform can make a man stand taller. It can also keep him from seeing who is standing in front of him." Ellison's eyes lowered. "Yes, sir. Do not let cloth do your thinking." The sentence was quiet enough to sound almost kind, but everyone who heard it knew it would stay with Ellison longer than any reprimand. Mercer turned slightly. "You will report to Captain Hayes after dismissal." Ellison nodded. "Yes, Admiral." There was no spectacle in it. No public destruction. Just consequence, clean and unavoidable. Caleb seemed relieved by that. He had not come to see a young man broken. He had come to keep a promise. Price watched as Mercer guided Caleb toward the passageway leading below deck. The sailors parted again, but this time their faces were different. They were not looking at a mystery anymore. They were looking at a man whose life had passed through silence and returned carrying proof. Near the hatch, Caleb paused and turned back toward the sea one last time. The flowers were barely visible now, small white points beyond the ship's shadow, moving into open water. Mercer followed his gaze. Reed would have laughed at all this attention, he said. Caleb's mouth softened. He would have charged admission. Mercer gave a quiet breath, the closest thing to laughter the deck had heard all morning. Then Caleb stepped through the hatch, leaving sunlight behind him. As he disappeared into the ship, every sailor remained standing until he was gone. Only then did the deck begin to move again, slowly, carefully, as if everyone aboard understood that something sacred had passed through their hands and almost been missed. Below deck, the passageway was quieter, but the ship still carried the memory of what had happened above. Caleb Whitaker walked slowly beside Admiral Nathaniel Mercer, his old shoes making a soft sound against the gray floor. Captain Hayes followed several paces behind, far enough to give them privacy, close enough to understand that privacy on a warship was never complete. The air smelled of steel, oil, clean paint, and coffee from some distant compartment. Caleb touched the bulkhead once with 2 fingers as they passed, not for balance, but recognition. "She is a good ship," he said. Mercer glanced at him. "You have been aboard for 10 minutes. A ship tells you quick." Mercer allowed the smallest smile. "You used to say that about people." Caleb looked ahead. "I was wrong more often with people." They reached the heritage room near the centerline passage, a small compartment lined with glass cases, old photographs, folded flags, model ships, and brass plaques polished by generations of careful hands. Petty Officer Daniel Price was already there, sent ahead by Chief Briggs. He stood beside the photograph he had remembered, shoulders squared, face still marked by the morning. 5 young men in an old black and white image stood beside a gray bulkhead, sleeves rolled to the forearm. Their faces were half lost to shadow. Their left arms showed the same broken anchor, 2 rope rings, and split star. Beneath the photo, the small typed card still read, "Unverified Maritime Team." Caleb stepped closer. For the first time all morning, his calm faltered. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Only in the way his breath caught and did not immediately return. His finger hovered near the glass, stopping just short of touching it. "Reed looked younger than I remember," he said. Mercer stood beside him, his eyes fixed on the photograph. "We all did." Price watched them read the faces. Not as history. Not as a display. As a room suddenly filled with men who had been absent for half a century. Caleb pointed gently, one by one, without touching the glass. "Reed. Alvarez. Boone. Mercer." His finger paused at the last figure. "Me." The room held the names. Captain Hayes took them in, careful as if receiving something fragile. Mercer turned to him. "Update the card." Hayes nodded. "Yes, Admiral." "With all 5 names?" Caleb answered before Mercer could. "With what can be said." Mercer looked at him. Caleb's eyes remained on the photograph. "Do not dress it up. Do not make us larger than we were. Just do not leave us nameless." That struck Price harder than any command he had ever heard. Not medals. Not speeches. Not a wall of polished words. Just names. Mercer's voice softened. "Done." For a while, no one spoke. Above them, faint through layers of steel, the ship returned to its duties. Footsteps moved. A hatch opened. A distant announcement rolled through the internal speakers and faded. Life continuing, as it always did, around the things men carried quietly. At last, Caleb reached for his cuff and pulled it back just enough to see the old tattoo. In the protected light of the heritage room, it looked even more faded, almost erased. Mercer rolled his own sleeve again, setting the darker mark beside it. 2 old arms. 2 matching signs. One nearly ghosted by time, one still clear enough to testify. Price looked away for a second, not from discomfort, but respect. Some things were not meant to be stared at too long. Caleb lowered his sleeve first. "You kept it well," he said. Mercer buttoned his cuff. "It kept me well." The answer stayed in the room after he said it. When Caleb finally turned to leave, Lieutenant Mark Ellison was standing in the passage outside, waiting at attention. He had not been summoned there. He had come on his own. His face was still pale, but his eyes were different now. Caleb stopped in front of him. Ellison did not speak first. He had learned at least that much. Caleb studied him for a moment, then said, "You will lead men someday who know things you do not. Remember that before you decide what they are worth." Ellison's throat moved. "I will, sir." Caleb nodded once and continued down the passage. Mercer followed, but before he left, he looked at Ellison. "Make sure you do." Hours later, after Caleb had stepped off the ship and disappeared into the waiting crowd on the pier, Petty Officer Price returned alone to the Heritage room. The old card had already been removed. A temporary handwritten note sat beneath the photograph, simple and plain: Caleb Whitaker. Nathaniel Mercer. Samuel Reed. Joseph Alvarez. Peter Boone. Maritime Recovery Team. Record pending. Price stood before it for a long time. Outside, the Atlantic wind moved across the harbor, pushing small waves against the hull. Somewhere far beyond the ship, 2 white flowers drifted where no one could see them anymore. And on the USS Arlington, no sailor who had witnessed that morning ever looked at an old man, a faded mark, or a quiet silence the same way again. Some symbols are not worn for pride. They are carried for those who never came home.